10% of women in the general population will undergo something called early ovarian aging. So this is a process where the rate of follicular degeneration, so follicles are these small fluid-filled structures contained in your ovaries, they produce the eggs that are there. They can start to decline at a much faster rate, so at an accelerated speed, and a woman under the age of 45 might find that her ovarian reserve has pretty much been depleted. On one end of the spectrum of this early ovarian decline is the premature ovarian insufficiency or failure. So this is where a woman actually goes through the menopause under the age of 40 and loses all of her eggs by then. And because this is quite a significant number of women, it's really important to discuss why this happens, what could be causing this, and also what options women have when it comes to helping them if they find themselves in this situation. So the first thing is, how would you know, how would you recognize whether this is something you could be affected by? This is where a fertility MOT could be really useful. So this looks at things like your antral follicle count, so how many follicles your ovaries have at a given period of time, and also something called your AMH, so anti-Müllerian hormone, which is produced by the ovaries and which is a really good indicator of what your reserve is like, or in other words, how fast your biological clock is ticking. And it's sometimes important to do that sooner rather than later, so even before you start to try for a family, because sometimes we can pick up certain things on there that wouldn't necessarily be detected. The antral follicle count and the AMH level are the things that give us a clue as to whether you might be at risk of early ovarian aging, and therefore it's really important to counsel you about how to time plan and how to seek further treatment options if you need them, or when to consider having a family, which perhaps might be sooner than you think. Let's start off by looking at how many follicles you're born with and what happens to these follicles later on in your life. Well, the biggest number of follicles that you're ever going to have is around 1 to 2 million, and this happens while you're actually still in the womb. So from that point onwards, even before you're born, there's already a decline in the number of follicles that you have. So actually, by the time you reach the age of puberty, when you have your first period, you actually have 300,000 follicles. But by the time you reach the age of 37, this rate of decline becomes a lot more pronounced and a lot faster. So for most women, when they reach that age, they will have around 1,000 follicles left. But what's really difficult to predict from here is how steep that rate of decline is going to be. And this is very variable for the majority of women out there. We have no way of necessarily predicting what this will be, and your AMH and antral follicle count will not tell us this. However, what we do know is that as the number of follicles starts to decline and as your ovarian reserve lowers, your FSH or follicle stimulating hormone, which is made by the brain, starts to increase. And this is almost your brain's way of trying to rev up your ovaries to say, actually, hang on a minute, I want you to produce a little bit more. So when we measure the FSH, or when your GP measures the FSH, they might start to find that this is increasing. And this is a sign that actually your ovaries are beginning to give up a little bit, and that the number of follicles that's there is starting to decline at quite a steep rate. So what then could sometimes happen is that your menstrual cycles can start to shorten, and also the number of follicles that's recruited even in a natural cycle without doing IVF starts to increase. Women become more at risk of cysts, so these are larger fluid-filled structures in the ovaries, and because more follicles are potentially being recruited in each cycle, it means that the risk of twin pregnancy also naturally goes up. But aside from age, what is also causing this process to occur? And this is what a lot of research is going into. So we think that there is a certain environment that these ovaries are exposed to, whether through our lifestyle or diet, that could potentially accelerate some of this rate of depletion when it comes to your follicles. And also things such as oxidative stress, which can also introduce free radicals that can accelerate the process of aging by damaging some of the DNA that's contained within the eggs that are in your ovaries as well. So there could be a number of different things that are interacting along with age to speed up this process. And this is another vital reason as to why it's really, really important that we look after what we eat, how we exercise, the stress levels that we're exposed to try and potentially stave off this process as much as we can, or at least try and preserve these eggs in their healthiest form as much as we can. So what are some of the reasons as to why a woman might undergo early ovarian aging or ultimately premature ovarian failure? Well, this is a very complex subject and we don't quite fully understand it, but some of the hypotheses out there are potentially being born premature or having an autoimmune condition that could also potentially mean the body attacks its own ovaries as well as other organs as well. There is also a genetic component, so if you have a mum or a sister who's affected by this, you could be at higher risk of also having earlier ovarian aging as well. So really important to check in with your mum and ask her what age she actually went through the menopause, as well, as that could be something that alerts you towards seeking further advice or at least a checkup. Another theory that's being proposed is that some women are just born with a smaller pool of follicles and eggs than the average woman, and that this therefore means it's their destiny to undergo premature or earlier ovarian aging simply because they don't have a big enough supply to start off with. But why does this happen? And again, lots of research is looking into the reasons as to why. And I believe this research is really, really exciting because it's showing us the potential effect of epigenetics, which I talk a lot about. And that's the potential for certain environmental factors to potentially influence gene programming and expression and what happens subsequently after that. So what we think could be important is the actual environment within which the female fetus grows. So that's the mother's womb. And that within this environment, depending on certain lifestyle choices such as diet and exercise, and potentially even exposure to certain toxins, smoking and alcohol being the most obvious ones, but also questioning things such as plastics that are out there and other toxins in the form of chemicals or pollution that we're exposed to having an impact. These are all things that could potentially influence that whole in utero environment, which could potentially mean that certain genes are programmed to actually mean that a girl that's born to a mother could end up having a smaller pool of follicles or eggs than she's actually supposed to have. Taking this even further, this is why it's so important that you look after your own health and everything I talk about in terms of nutritional supply in the form of your diet, exercise, stress relief, toxin exposure, because when it comes to your own fertility and then conceiving later, you have to bear in mind that potentially every lifestyle choice that you make could have the possibility of having an effect of any future children and generations of children that are born as well. The good news is that when you understand this condition and you go and get tested, the younger you are when you're diagnosed with the possibility of earlier ovarian aging, the greater your chance of being able to conceive naturally. And this is because there hasn't been such a long period of time that's passed that's been able to damage the DNA within these eggs. So actually, you still have a fairly good chance of success. And even if you do need IVF, your chances of success with that are all the better because the quality of the eggs that you have will have been preserved. Ultimately, if IVF doesn't work, there is always the prospect of donor eggs as well. So really important to consider your options and get the appropriate counselling that you need. Any woman who goes through the process of earlier ovarian aging or earlier menopause is going to need support later on with hormones. And this is because our hormones are not just in charge of our fertility, but also a whole range of other things. It's important to support your cardiovascular system, your brain function, your mood, and also your bones as well. So in order to try and reduce your chance of any heart disease and osteoporosis, it will be important that you discuss with your GP being put on longer term HRT after you've completed your family.